I am very pleased to see Sarah Goody and Jade Northrup. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, so let's just start. I mean, Sarah, and it'll be for both of you. I mean, what got you involved in this movement? What inspires you? Are your friends and family supportive? Just, I'll get some basics out of the way here.
Sure, I can start first. In sixth grade, I watched a documentary called Cowspiracy. And this was around the same time that my sixth grade science teacher decided to do a unit on climate change and what that would mean for me, for my community, and my future. And I could see these connections between the climate crisis and the animal agriculture industry. And I felt like I'd been lied to my whole life, that it wasn't just happy cows on happy farms and that we weren't okay, that the climate changing was no big deal, because it truly is a matter of life or death and is already impacting our community of the Bay Area and all around the world. And it's an issue that is defining my generation. So I knew that I had to do something and stand up. And that's when I started getting involved in climate and animal activism. In sixth grade, I was also sent out to New York to lead a summit for New York public school students on climate change. And that's where I learned about the Fridays for Future movement through youth activist Alexandria Villasenor, who at the time was on her 18th week striking outside the United Nations. And I was so inspired by her initiative and by the efforts that she was taking, and decided to bring that back home to the San Francisco Bay Area, where I striked throughout middle school and continuing today on my, I want to say 65th week of my climate strike. Yay! And in addition to striking, I've been working with our community and empowering young people to use their voice and to stand up on the issues that they're passionate about through two organizations that I lead, Climate Now and Broadway Speaks Up. In 2019, I started Climate Now as a way to provide young people in my community of Marin County with an outlet to learn about environmental initiatives and to take climate action. And then earlier this year, I started this Instagram initiative called Broadway Speaks Up as a way to uplift Broadway performers' voices and inspire theater goers around the world to take climate action and look at and reflect on their daily lives and see what little changes they can make. So we've had performers from over 50 Broadway shows, including Hamilton, Phantom of the Opera, Cats, lots of other, really well-known favorites. And then just in addition to those organizations, the main way that I'm working with young people is through contributions with different media outlets and collaborating with places like Forbes and Teen Vogue and NBC News in order to bring increased awareness to these environmental issues that are, going to define our generation and define what, the future looks like.
For sure. Great. Thanks. And Jade, what got you involved? What was the impetus, the inspiration, the tipping point?
Yeah. So I want to talk about that from a couple of different prongs. First of all, I am definitely the newbie in this panel. Sarah, I really admire how much work you've been doing. You got started like a rocket from sixth grade. And so I have a lot of respect for what you're doing. For me, I was in seventh or eighth grade. And we learned in, I think it was like a physical sciences class. And I basically started learning a little bit about the ozone hole at that point. This was in the late 80s. And I'm a little older. And I wrote a paper on the ozone hole and the fact that it was just like this chemical that we were creating and releasing into the atmosphere because we weren't careful with it, with CFCs. And I was just kind of shocked. I remember getting angry. I remember it was one of the first points in my life where I really felt like people are being stupid and there's this horrible injustice and we need to do something about it. And what struck me was none of my classmates, none of the teachers, nobody that I talked to seemed to share the concern. They were like, yeah, that sucks. And it's interesting because now looking back, we've largely, at least for now, solved CFC crisis, the ozone hole covered up. It's a much smaller scale thing than dealing with greenhouse gas, the ecological crisis, all that kind of stuff. But it's proof that if we do take, concerted action, we actually can improve the Earth systems that we're destroying, through our carelessness. But what's interesting is for me then, I kind of had this notion in the background, and I was learning the science behind global warming and the ecological crisis, really, and the extinction crisis over the next like 10, 15, 20 years. But I grew up in Texas. I was around a bunch of people where, like, for me, even thinking about eating less meat was heresy. You know, and I started sort of flirting with vegetarianism when I was in high school, but it wasn't until I got into college and I moved away from Texas, and I was in an opportunity where there was a cafeteria. I was on a meal plan, and so I could pick and choose the food I had. So then I was finally like, free at last, hell yeah, I'm gonna, you know, I can eat how I want to, without having to sort of cook all my own meals, because I'd been in a, you know, family setting before. And but anyways, for me, activism started around that period when I got involved with some groups that were basically dealing with organized labor in the college town where I was at, and there was basically some union busting actions, and there was some like people that were violating contracts, and so starting to just kind of like go along as a supporter in some of these labor things where people were going and striking and packing city hall, or you know, blocking streets and stuff like that with the labor unions, was kind of like my intro to seeing what actually getting involved with action was like. But this was back in the early 2000s. Then after that, there was a little bit of sort of around the Iraq War back in 2003. I actually drove up to DC and was part of some massive strikes that were happening up there, where people were getting punched by the police and bloodied. And it's where I first saw people really putting themselves on the line against the security forces in a way that I thought was courageous and brave, in a way that I just couldn't understand. But for me, my climate activism was something, along with my vegetarianism, that I sort of kept to myself. You know, I kept kind of reading about stuff, but it wasn't until, I'd say, spring of 2019, where I had been, you know, dealing with depression, dealing with anxiety for a variety of reasons for a long time. And I had told myself over a large part of the past, like 5, 10 years, like, look, I really just need to sort of moderate how much I read about climate. This is too heavy. I can't handle it. I know the science. It seems like nobody gives a shit about this, pardon my French. But I couldn't take it, because there was this huge disconnect between what science was showing and what my community here, even in California, was doing in terms of concrete action. And that cognitive dissonance was just crippling for me. But sort of late 2018, I was like, you know what, this is getting too clear. We've been having these wildfires. It's really clear that the climate is changing. We're seeing the Arctic destabilizing. We're seeing these record high temperatures in the Arctic and the Antarctic. So I started letting myself read the science again a little bit more, you know, like changed my Reddit filters or whatever, subscribe to some different subreddits that were dealing more with the science and all that. And it was devastating. After about 4 or 5 months of really letting this information back in and allowing myself to focus on it, I was reading Naomi Klein. I was reading some other books that were really kind of dealing headlong with this. I found myself literally at the point where I couldn't sleep. I was having problems eating, you know, even my healthy vegan diet, I just didn't have the stomach for food. And it was really because I felt this crisis where, like, I'm going to my job, I'm going to the market and getting food, you know, I have all of my sort of necessities met, but this crisis is so big, I have to do something. And so I'd say after about a week of just feeling just awful about this, I finally saw a climate group that was over in the UK that was doing these huge blockades and stuff. This was back early in 2019. They were blocking 7 bridges simultaneously in London and trying to force Parliament to do a climate emergency declaration and all this stuff. And it had filtered up through my news bubble. You know, everybody's familiar, like whenever you do searches and stuff, the media that you get through feeds like Google News or Apple News or, you know, whatever it is, or Facebook in particular, are tailored to what you want to see, right? And so my filter bubble, I had actually tuned it so I wasn't seeing a lot of climate news, because again, it was this hard thing. But Extinction Rebellion, with those protests in London, was rocketing to the top. I was seeing it in the sort of climate related headlines. It was all over the place. And so for me, like literally that weekend, there was a general meeting that the Extinction Rebellion crew locally was holding. And so I went out and got involved. And shortly afterwards, we were doing die-ins and at Senator Feinstein's office and holding, like, you know, rallies and joining with other groups. But I've basically been involved ever since. So it's about 1.5 years now, which is a relative short period of time. But yeah, it was, for me, it was a long journey of just getting fed up with people not taking action, you know?
Well, it sounds like you were involved in a lot of things. You're relatively recent to this form of activism, but activism doesn't sound new to you.
You know, but it was just things that I was like dropping in, you know. It wasn't at the level where like Sarah mentioned, she's done all this work where she's actually instigating things and helping bring it together. Like there's a big difference between I'm on the mailing list, I might show up to an action, versus like I'm really trying to help push the organization forward. And I'm sure you guys know with the San Francisco Veg Society, it's like it takes a lot of work to sort
Indeed.
of create a community and create events and push things forward.
It does. Great, thank you for that. So Sarah, so you started Climate Now, you have this, theater project, and yet theaters are closed down. So, here we are in the pandemic, nothing we fully expected, nothing we would have chosen. How is the pandemic affecting your activism? And if appropriate, how has it affected your perspectives on anything?
It's been really difficult with the pandemic because I remember that first week coming home and being so excited not to have school for, a week or two, and being like, oh my God, I had so much on my plate at that time. I was planning a bunch of different events. I was like, this gives me the time to just finish everything, get everything off my plate. And that time turned into months. Then, now it's like closer and closer to a year. And it's just absolutely mind-blowing that we're still in this pandemic. And I think so much of what I'm doing and what I've done has changed because of the pandemic. Like I was saying, I started this Broadway initiative, and that's because the pandemic has been really hard on my mental health. And in terms of activism burnout, I've always struggled with depression and anxiety. And when we had this pandemic, it was I had finally kind of overcome those obstacles, and then coming back into this time where I wasn't able to go out, I wasn't able to interact with other people. And then in terms of activism, I wasn't able to go strike or go to a community meeting and interact with, some of my best friends. And that was really tough for me. And I started Broadway Speaks Up because I wanted to create this new community. And I've always been a really avid theater nerd. And I think there's a lot of similarities between, the Broadway community and between the climate community, just in terms of how loving everyone is, how supportive people are, and, how close the community can be. And I wanted to bridge those gaps and really create this, organization and this initiative to help connect these people and to hopefully use the Broadway community as a way to spread awareness to a different population that we might not otherwise interact with as climate activists. And then, just going off in general, how this pandemic has, changed activism. It's really difficult to just school or work on Zoom or online, but then you add in activism and sending, tens of emails a day, and then going and joining Zoom calls to go meet with different organizations, then going and creating graphics, and then sending out a newsletter, and going and looking at analytics and posting on social media. It's so much, and so much of it is online and virtual, which makes it really difficult to wake up in the morning, go to school, for me or for other people, go to work, then go and do this full day of activism. And then the only real way to connect with friends and connect with people that, you're close with is through FaceTime or through a call. So it's like this complete shift to an online and virtual life, which has been really difficult for me. What I've been so lucky to have is, over in June, I moved out to Hawaii to go live with my aunt and uncle, who are the curators of Three Ring Ranch Exotic Animal Sanctuary. So the only accredited exotic animal sanctuary in the state of Hawaii. So I've been there ever since, just working with animals and being out on the beach. It's been the most incredible experience, and I'm so grateful, because I really don't know how I'd be able to take on this workload and do as much activism as I do if I didn't have this other outlet, which is why, I can really resonate and be, respect that a lot of other activists during this time are just having a hard time getting up and doing the work because it's really hard. They don't have that outlet like I have here.
That's great. I'm wondering, because the actors are out of work, maybe it's easier for you to reach them and get them to participate. Do you think so?
It has been, because they have so much more time on their hands. And I think with this uprising in information and awareness around social justice issues with the upcoming election, and then with Black Lives Matter movement and racial inequality in our country, it's caused so many more people, especially Broadway performers who already have cared about these issues for a long time, to really propel them to take action. And I think what's been so amazing about 2020 and about this activism community is that we've really started to show people how important taking that step, taking that action, going further than just looking within your individual self, and taking that step, taking that risk to go join a community and actually be part of a movement. And that's why we've seen so many people, at least in my own organizations, get involved and want to do something about these issues that they care about.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Jade, so tell us about, similarities and differences, the pros and cons of, as Sarah said, essentially, we've been assimilated into the virtual world, whether we want to or not.
Yeah, no. So one request I have is, could I be made a co-host so that I can share my screen? Because I have like a little visual example of how Extinction Rebellion in the Bay Area has evolved from last year through the beginning of the pandemic to where we are now. And I think it'll be better than me just blabbing my mouth flaps for the 10 minutes trying to explain it. But one of the things that I would say is, oh damn it, I forgot. There was another point, but I have the screen share. Okay, let's try this. So what I'm going to do is go through. I'm going to go through some stuff from our Facebook page that's showing some events that we did in collaboration with other partner organizations, like the September 25th Wall Street West shutdown that we did. And then I'm going to go through on the Extinction Rebellion website and show you guys kind of like, this is the timeline of what we've been doing this year, because it's been very different under the pandemic, and we've been kind of trying to figure out how to make it work.
Let's take a look.
So here we go. So this was September 25th, 2019. There were, can you guys see the photo?
Yes.
There were like, I think we had somewhere close to 600 activists that were out from like a bunch of different organizations. That's actually me in the red. And we basically shut down this area of San Francisco, and we held the street. It was about 4 city blocks that we held for most of the day. And people painted these huge murals. And one of the focuses was the Wells Fargo building, because I don't know if everybody knows this, but Wells Fargo, Chase, Liberty Mutual, BlackRock, these different financial organizations they're the biggest financiers of fossil fuel in the world currently. Chase and Wells Fargo are like number 1 and 2. Goldman Sachs is also up there. And so there's been this campaign that 350 and basically created the Stop the Money Pipeline Coalition. And they've done a lot of the sort of think tank stuff behind this. But this was this huge effort where Extinction Rebellion came out, and we had a group that was dressed up as these red rebels. And we moved kind of like at this like super slow-mo pace silently through the streets and spooked everybody in a good way, to some people that actually climbed up on the Wells Fargo building and dropped a banner, and they got the police, basically arrested and then didn't cite them. They just kind of like took them downtown and then released them, because San Francisco is super friendly about, San Francisco is actually really friendly about free speech, but that's a whole other thing. Like, you can do a lot, and the police will just be like, yeah, they're exercising their First Amendment right. And the DA in San Francisco is known to not press prosecution for any sort of demonstrations or whatever, as long as there isn't, harm to anybody. It's nonviolent. There's no property damage. So that's kind of where we were last year. Switching gears. So this was like late last year. We were still doing like die-ins and these huge rallies and stuff. But then as we get into the beginning of the year, we had a group that was doing these beautiful, beautiful tombstones that were basically, I don't have the photos here. There were these tombstones that they were building that were these beautiful monuments to species that were going extinct or were in danger of going extinct. Wow. Like a tombstone for the vaquita, which is this little whale that I think there's maybe 10 of them down in the sort of Baja California region left in the wild. And so they were building these, but what ended up happening is we wanted to start using these at actions. And I'll come back to that in a second. Our last action out on the streets was actually February 28th. We did an action at a Chase Bank down in downtown Oakland, and we had a few hundred people come out, and it was great. People went into the bank and did a die-in, and you know, it was fun, and we were able to do sort of like fun kind of media spectacles, and Youth versus Apocalypse was there, and people were in the bank doing a die-in, and we did a theater thing about pipelines exploding, and there was a guy who came and pretended to be the CEO of Chase and gave a great fake speech, and it was hilarious. So I mean, we were just able to like have these really great events, right? And what's interesting is like when you have an event like this, there's actually there's a couple of different audiences. One, being honest, is the activists ourselves. It's fun. It's community building to get out on the street and do this, and you get a feeling of progress, like you're actually doing something. Two are the sort of stakeholders. So in this case, Chase, right? We want to get messages to Chase. At one of our previous Stop the Money Pipeline events back in January, there was somebody from International Chase Security that had actually flown in and infiltrated the group. And one of our legal observers actually noticed that she worked for Chase Security because he overheard conversations with her and the branch manager. And we ended up kind of unmasking her, so to speak. And she then changed her behavior rapidly. But it was awesome. Like here, Chase was so concerned about what these activists were doing, trying to basically say, look, they're the #1 funder of dirty oil, that they sent somebody from their international security team. So that was
getting through.
Yeah, so that was great. So that the next audience after people like Chase is the general public. And the way you do that is by taking these great photos and having these great sort of artistic events, and doing videos and stuff. But and you put those out on social media or whatever. And the last audience is basically if you can get journalism and the media to cover the thing and the press. And people like Extinction Rebellion do things like over in the UK or in parts of Europe, like shutting down bridges and blocking traffic because it gets press, because the arrests, because sort of pushing the rules. It's not just a permitted march where everybody can just ignore it. You're doing something a little subversive. You're pushing the boundaries to get attention, and you're doing it consciously. Like, I'm willing to risk arrest even, in some people's case, because this message needs to get out there. So,
Right.
As you can imagine though, the tombstones, all of a sudden we found ourselves in a pandemic, and this group that had been spending months building these beautiful loving tombstones were something that we still haven't been able to use as an image, because all of a sudden we found ourselves in the middle of this huge pandemic that was spreading. And so we put out a statement that was about how, we support everybody that's going through this pandemic. And then afterwards, we didn't really know what was going on, but then with the murder of George Floyd and with the Breonna Taylor, her getting murdered basically coming out, there was this huge upwelling of the movement for Black Lives that was sweeping over the country. And a lot of the people that were involved in Extinction Rebellion were like, well, we have to support this, and we have to get out on the streets and support it. And so like the Anti-Police Terror Project, and Diablo Rising Tide and all these other groups that were organizing over here in East Bay, people were going out and supporting that. So all of a sudden we found ourselves out on the streets, but it wasn't for climate. But we were just mainly doing that as allies. And
so important to make those coalitions. So important
absolutely.
To stand up for civil rights and human rights. We know that all our movements are connected, and so that's great.
Well, exactly. Like we basically found. Well, we can come back to that. You can't have climate justice without racial justice, and we could talk about that and go on at length. But that's something that I've learned a lot about this year, and it's really clear in my mind. But we've also been doing things like mural projects because it's easy and safe to do that socially distanced. People are wearing masks. It's a 20-foot wide thing. But I also wanted to get to just really, really briefly. So what have we been doing? We've been doing online Zoom stuff. So for Earth Day, we've worked with 350 Silicon Valley. We did our own thing. We did this thing that was a defundathon. So we had about 150 people show up. One of the organizers that I work with, she basically cold called a bunch of climate comedians. So JC Kakole, Jenny Yang, Clark Jones. She just looked up climate comedy on YouTube and found people that had done anything having to do with climate, cold called them. And we did a defundathon, which was basically this hour-long program where they were talking schmack, but also doing some like educational material about how banks and these insurance companies are funding tar sands pipelines and all this horrible stuff. And we had people call in on the Zoom call and pledge, I'm going to divest my 401k or whatever from this, or I'm going to take my savings that I have with Wells Fargo and I'm going to move them to a credit union. And we had a defundathon, we had a defundometer, which was basically this silly gauge that we sort of like, it's like a fundraiser thing. And we ended up, getting all the way towards saving the planet by saying, these 15 people have basically pledged this amount that they're going to divest. So that was
That's
really
really
fun,
clever. No, I
you
think
know?
it's
And
fantastic.
so we've just tried to do stuff where we're like getting together and essentially doing stuff like doing Twitter storms or whatever online. And so that's been the gist of it. But, and this is one more really interesting thing. There was a group in Hunters Point called Green Action. It's basically an environmental nonprofit that focuses on frontline communities. And if you guys don't know about the Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood in San Francisco, it's essentially where a bunch of the carriers came back after World War II and the Navy ships that were involved in nuclear testing. So they had these radioactive, huge hunks of metal, came back, got decommissioned, and a lot of the raw materials for those got buried in Bayview Hunters Point. And it's basically a community in South San Francisco that's predominantly Black. It's a very poor community relative to like the median income in San Francisco. And they just have this history of all these sort of like environmental things that have been dumped on their neighborhood. So some Extinction Rebellion people got together and we were planning a car caravan that was going to go from this neighborhood and through some of their parks and stuff and go up to City Hall and try and get attention of the mayor of San Francisco. And we had to keep rescheduling it because a lot of the people in that community had asthma and had breathing complications. And because of the wildfires, we actually had to infinitely postpone a car caravan event that was talking about how this community couldn't breathe because of environmental pollution and the racism that was behind putting it in their neighborhood. So that was kind of a meta thing that happened in COVID. And then the last thing I'll say is we're finally back out on the streets. So this was basically a week and a half ago. XR and a bunch of other groups, 1,000 Grandmothers, Diablo Rising Tide, all these other people, 350, got together and did an action down at Black Rock. It was socially distant. We had these huge banners and you have, you know, people that are far, everybody's wearing masks. But it did feel good to like be getting back out on the streets again and doing this kind of action. But you'll see everybody's wearing masks and everybody's being careful. But sorry that took a while, but that's sort of been the arc of how we've gone in the pandemic, trying to kind of respond.
I appreciate you showing this. You know, when I think back to 2019, I mean, some of my most enjoyable days were out on the climate strikes in downtown San Francisco. Like you said, the love, the feeling of solidarity, the fun. I mean, we should be allowed to dance in our revolution, you know, and then also, of course, attracting the media and letting the BlackRock workers see what we're doing as they come in and out, as they look down through the window, you know. Yep. Some smiling, some, you know, smirking, who knows, but that's okay. You know? So, you know, as you both know, not all vegans are climate activists and not all climate activists are vegan. So Sarah, tell me, how does your climate activism connect to your veganism?
Well, I went vegan after that time in 6th grade when I first learned about climate change and the intersections with the animal agriculture industry. And I've always been, you know, really connected to animals, and it's always been a big passion of mine. So knowing that I was firsthand contributing to, you know, the suffering of these animals as well as increased carbon emissions was terrifying. I couldn't imagine that I myself was, you know, putting my money, putting my everything into this destructive process that was hurting living things. And I just knew that there was no way I would be able to, you know, continue eating meat, continue supporting the, you know, animal agriculture industry if this was the way that it went. And it's been interesting working with different climate activists and seeing their different reactions, because I think a lot of people, when they hear vegan, they're like, why would you ever do that? Why? It just doesn't make sense. Why would you want to give that up? And even with climate activists, I've known a lot who are just not, you know, able to completely give those things up. And I think that just reflects a lot about our society and how people are, you know, stereotyping vegans and, you know, people who are climate activists. And, you know, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I think that, you know, it's been a very interesting, you know, situation to be a vegan and be a climate activist and see how the two intersect and see how different climate activists respond to veganism. And I think a lot are super up for the idea, but, you know, this is the way that America runs. This is the way we've grown up, going to McDonald's, going to Burger King, where it's just a part of our culture and our society, which is the key aspect, I think, is that word culture, is that we need to start, making veganism fun, making a plant-based diet something that's, it is fun, exactly. That's, seen everywhere and seen by all people, not as, restricting their diet and as restricting them from certain things, but as gaining something new, as gaining this new world of food and of fun, because it allows you to try new things, to experiment in the kitchen. And I think that's how we need to start shifting the mindset of the general public and, of other climate activists.
And by being vegan and by being activists, and especially climate activists, we're not sacrificing anything. We're getting so much, and I'm thinking of, famous teenager Greta Thunberg, who became vegan for the climate. I'm thinking of nonagenarian David Attenborough, who became vegan for the climate. But yet, interestingly, with both of them, they're primarily focused on the climate and environmental concerns, and they mention but largely play down their veganism. Jade, and you, how do you see the connections? How does it play out in your life?
Well, I love that you talked about Greta Thunberg and David Attenborough playing it down, because I've found that there's been pressure for that. And I think that that's a sort of strategic and tactical decision to make, is, how much you sort of talk about your veganism or your diet. One thing that's really been interesting to me in activism is I feel like everybody that comes into activism has their own biases or their own personal agendas or whatever. And they come into a group and they're like, oh, I'm all about this thing. I want to bring this thing to the activism. And sometimes that can be really good. And sometimes that can be really disruptive, right? Because you're like, wow, all you're only about topic X, Y, or Z, and it's to the point where it's actually disrupting the group. And I could name a bunch of topics, but a lot of them are sort of controversial things or whatever, are you pro or against nuclear? And, we've had some people that are scientists that are very pro-nuclear in this group, and people that are very anti-nuclear, and that's actually their only agenda.
Wow.
And veganism is interesting because it can be one of these polarizing things. I think diet is something that is close to people. You're made of what you eat. It's this very personal thing. People have a lot of their psychological safety rests on food. Just feeling, whether you're feeling whole or not, is based on have you eaten well. And so what I find is, for me with veganism, I find it's an interesting place to walk the talk. So if you're talking about you want to be involved in climate, don't fly as much. Right? Or don't fly at all. Don't drive as much, or don't drive at all. Eat plant-based as much as you can. There's all these things that you can do in the personal action sphere. But I find that when I'm working with a community that's diverse in a lot of different, on a lot of different axes, that actually bringing up things that can divide us can actually just sort of get us roiled, and actually can break down the sort of big tent unity that you really need for people to get together and act. And so I've learned, instead of trying to sort of have these debates about every little thing, to let more and more stuff go and to focus on the commonalities. And I think one thing that's really interesting is, I come from a place of privilege. I have a cushy job. I'm able to afford nice, organic veggies and the time to cook and prepare food and all this kind of stuff. But I think that while everybody could have a vegan diet, there's another axis to this, which is, I think more and more people are focusing on the fact that we've been told as individuals in this sort of consumer mindset, oh, you know what? Plastics are okay as long as you recycle. Or, you know what? The planetary crisis and animal agriculture is going to be okay as long as you eat vegan or buy our prepackaged, soy milk or whatever. But I think that's a little distorted, because and this isn't just me, people are acknowledging that the plastic recycling campaign was actually something that was PR from the plastics industry. Look it up. There's actually a lot of news that's come out about that.
Just saw that on NPR, yeah.
And so, but what is really powerful is collective action. And so one thing that I've heard, there was a little bit of conversation about this last week on Hot Air, which is a great podcast about climate, that Mary Anais Heglar, and I forget her co-host's name, do, but basically they were talking about how, look, you have a lot of frontline communities, you have a lot of people of color, you have a lot of like just communities that basically don't have the resources and the privilege, that are being told, you need to give up your car, you need to give up meat, you need to do this, that, or the other. And their point was that that doesn't go over very well with a lot of those communities, because they're aware that the environmental crisis is largely the creation of billionaires and big companies and people like Exxon and stuff that have known that what they're doing is going to cause harm, but they've been doing everything they can to subvert the political process and to basically subvert public opinion so that we as a culture don't steer. And so the whole point is collective action is necessary too. And so I guess to answer your question in a really oblique way, not all vegans are climate activists, but maybe should consider getting involved, and not all climate activists are vegan, but I think they should if they can. But because, you know, everybody has different perspectives and different needs, focusing on how we can get together and cooperate and work together and find areas of overlap and find areas of agreement so that we can have these mass movements, so that we can scale up and work collectively together, seems to be like super important, but it's also really challenging.
And I think we need to organize in whatever communities and arenas we enter.
Absolutely.
Whether it's the climate community, the vegan community, the theater community,
yep.
Whether it's, you know, sports, music, academics, gardening, right? All of those things can relate actually to veganism and to the climate crisis. So I encourage, I don't need to encourage you to, I encourage anyone who's listening that whatever community you're in, physical community, digital community, or otherwise, there are ways to get involved. And, you know, as Joan Baez, who famously said, action is the antidote to despair. So sadly, there's a lot to despair about, but the more we get involved, not only is there a better chance that we will make a positive difference in the world, but we'll feel better. It's good for our mental health, it's good for our physical health, it's good for building friendships and relationships and making connections, expanding our social capital, our cultural capital. And you know, here we are. So I want to thank you so much, Sarah and Jade, for being here, for giving us your wisdom, and for being just really, you know, great activists in the community. You're making the world a better place, and I'm confident you're also making your lives better lives. And so I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now we just have some dead air.
Hey, Dan, I'm out walking the dogs.
Oh, good. I'm just gonna, I haven't been checking the chat, or we can see if anyone, I don't know if we have to end or if people have questions. Let's see.
We still have a few minutes. If Stefan, if you can go into the chat and see, there we go. Stefan just put a message out for everybody to type their questions into the chat, and then we can get some Q&A going, because we do have a few minutes left for that.
Okay. Hey, you know what? While we're waiting for a question, I'll take more time with you too. So I think we hinted at this, but didn't explicitly say it. Just tell, and if we could be really quick about it. But if first, Sarah, if you could say, like, what's been most rewarding to you? I mean, you're trying to make the world better, right? We hinted at that. We talked about this. But tell me how your activism is rewarding for your life.
Knowing that I'm playing this role in this greater movement, that I'm one of, you know, hundreds of thousands of young people and adults who are passionate about creating a better future, has really been the defining message of my life so far. And knowing that I'm able to use my world and use my privilege to help others and to inspire other people to join me and get involved and take action, and empowering them to be confident in themselves and to believe in themselves, and knowing that, you know, their voices do matter. I actually received this letter a few weeks ago from an 8-year-old who saw my segment on NBC Nightly News and sent me a message saying now she's so excited because she's always wanted to take climate action. She just never knew how. And she's been passionate about climate change. She just never knew she could do something about it. And now I've been, contacting her and back and forth and showing her and sharing with her ideas for how she can make a difference, and seeing that, the littlest things we do can have such a big impact on other people's lives, and that, we can plant these seeds in our younger generation and, create a future that is, better than this one that we have right now. So that's just how rewarding activism has been for me. And it's showed me that I'm not going to be able to live a life or live a future where activism isn't a part of my daily routine and isn't something that I'm always striving to do and get better at.
That's so cute and so inspiring. And also, Sarah, I mean, being 15, you have to allow us to enjoy the humor of you talking about the younger generation. But I guess an 8-year-old. Jade, so tell us, how has this been personally rewarding for you?
Well, I said that I got into it because I was having problems sleeping and eating because I was like stressed out because I wasn't doing anything.
Yeah.
But I can say my appetite is great. I'm eating lots of yummy vegan food, and I sleep well because I'm so busy between job and organizing and trying to have a personal life. So those problems have been solved great.
So you're mentally and physically healthier.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's a win-win-win. But no, I mean, seriously, like meeting the people, just like getting myself out of the normal sort of patterns and circles that I was in. One of the things that I found really interesting about the activist community is everybody involved, even if you think they're a jerk, is there because they're passionate enough to be volunteering their time, about whatever the topic is. In my case, the climate crisis, the climate and ecological emergency, because I like to include the ecological emergency because the plants and animals, like the entire terrestrial ecosphere, is really what's at risk here. And I hate it when people talk about like, oh, the climate, and what if we lose whales so that people in future generations won't be able to enjoy learning and seeing the whales? It's like, no, screw that. What if we lose the whales and then that's genocide against a species? That's the problem.
Yes.
Anyways, yeah, I think for me, it's just like the people involved are great. And you meet people when you're dealing with stuff that's like around a topic or an issue. You meet people like I'm working with people that are way younger than me and people that have been retired for a while, but are still like wanting to, get out on the streets and be active. And it's great to be around people like that. It really does restore some faith in humanity for me, because there's people willing to invest their time in something bigger than themselves. And it just feels, it's great to be a part of that. And it's great to feel like, even if we're not having an impact as big as I wish we could, or it's not moving as fast or whatever, it doesn't matter. Like we're doing our best, we're doing what we can. And that at the end of the day, that's all you really can do. There's a great definition I saw recently of hope. And it's not, hope isn't acting because you think you're going to be successful. Hope is, even in the face of probable defeat, even in the face of huge odds where it looks like there's no way possible that you're going to be able to succeed, you act anyway. And I love that definition of hope, because that's the sort of thing that I think drives people to survive and to work together and to try and help each other out, even in the faces of the most challenging odds.
That's great. I'm thinking though, I'm thinking of this as a health plan now, because people aren't going to the gyms, and yeah, people are doing therapy over Zoom, but they're not going to doctors' offices, whether for mental health or physical health. But maybe we don't need that quite as much. Maybe we just need to get out or even in and do more activism. If we eat better with a plant-based diet, if we get out there and try to make a difference for the climate and stem this climate crisis, and maybe if we stop thinking so anthropocentrically, so that it's not all about humans. I mean, we talk about narcissism on the individual level, and we have a narcissism on our species level. Mm-hmm. And not that we care enough about humans, but on a certain level, we're caring so much about humans, like you said, because we want to see the whales, or people want to see the Amazon rainforest or derive food or medicine from it, which is fine on a certain level. But it's much more than that, like you said about ecology.
Yep.
The whales and the Amazon and everything else exists for its own sake.
Yep.
Not simply for humans to enjoy and exploit, and whatever else one might do with it.
Can I interject one small thing on that note, just super brief? One of the things that the people that I work with are really good about, and I've actually failed in this talk, is to always acknowledge the fact that the community that we're in right now. I live in Berkeley. I'm on indigenous land that was never ceded. The Ohlone people lived here before I did, and I think one of the things that we're finding is like people really need to connect, and people need to listen to traditional wisdom of cultures before us, because the Ohlone people that lived here in the East Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area, they used controlled burns. They understood how to live with the ecosystem. They lived very, very in tune, and really were great stewards of this land for hundreds, if not thousands of years before Europeans arrived here. And we've screwed it all up in pretty short order. But yeah, so for me, that's a constant challenge to remember that, like, we don't even have to invent all these solutions ourselves. Sometimes paying attention to what came before and being humble and listening to that is a really, really powerful, it's just a powerful thing that we kind of all need to do.
I like what you said about listening to Ohlone and other native people, and also Miwok in the area, coastal Miwok, because a lot more progressives have just been making sort of the statement that we're on Ohlone land, and that, like you said, it's unceded. That's something, but actually I don't care too much for just the symbolism of that, because then we're basically saying we're occupiers and we just want to announce that we're occupying this land illegally. That's not nearly good enough to me. As a culture, we've committed genocide against the indigenous, and so I think we do need to actively welcome in their voices. Sadly, there's relatively few of them, but of the people who exist, not just respect, but welcome in and listen to their voices is really important, and to learn the lessons. And that should also mean, learning some of the history of the peoples, and so much of the language. I think Ramaytush has been destroyed, but even learning some of the words. Kudos to San Francisco. Actually, some of the words from the Ohlone language are in plaques downtown, not far from the ballpark. So even just to learn a few words is valuable. So thanks again, Sarah. Thanks again, Jade. I very much appreciate it. It's been great being with you.